At 45, here's the part no one says out loud. You're not starting fresh anymore. You're living the outcome of your past decisions, and suddenly the margin for error feels uncomfortably small.
And the uncomfortable part, there's less time to fix anything now, and a lot more consequences if you don't, which is where most people quietly start realizing this isn't as flexible as it used to be. Because at 25, mistakes were cheap, at 35, they were manageable, but at 45, they don't disappear anymore. They just sit there quietly and start compounding into something much harder to ignore. And this is the stage where retirement is finally visible, responsibilities are already high, and time feels limited, which is exactly why clarity suddenly becomes a lot more valuable than just ambition. So now you start noticing something strange. People aren't really lacking income at this stage, they're just moving fast without direction, which somehow looks productive, until you actually stop and look at it. Because most people think the answer is just earning more, but at this stage, that's rarely the real problem. And that's exactly where things start getting slightly uncomfortable to admit. Because the real issue isn't how much you earn anymore, it's what you've already built, what you still owe, and what quietly depends on you, whether you're fully prepared for that or not. So at this point, your money should actually be doing something for you, because if it's just sitting there quietly, you're not being safe. You're slowly losing time without realizing it. Because now you don't really have decades left for compounding to quietly fix things in the background, which means time isn't something you can casually rely on anymore like before. So now your capital actually needs to do three things at the same time. It needs to grow, protect what you've built, and quietly generate something back. Otherwise, it's just sitting there. And debt usually feels normal for a long time, until it suddenly doesn't. Because what once felt manageable slowly turns into something that just sits there, quietly adding pressure in the background. Because at 25, debt feels like future income, but at 45, it starts feeling more like future stress. And that shift is where most people realize things aren't as flexible anymore. Because now you're actually closer to the end than the beginning. Which sounds simple, but once that really sinks in, it quietly changes how every financial decision starts to feel.
And at this point, you don't really want more payments anymore, you just want some little peace, which is surprisingly harder to get when everything around you still needs attention.
And then there's the lifestyle part, because as income slowly goes up, expenses quietly follow, and that's where things start becoming dangerous without really looking dangerous at all. And over time, those expenses stop feeling flexible, they turn into fixed pressure, which just sits there every month, quietly demanding attention whether you feel ready for it or not. And the more your life starts costing every month, the less control you actually have, which is a strange trade because it looks like progress from the outside. So at this stage, it's not really about chasing growth anymore, it's about controlling what you already have, because one careless move now can quietly undo years of effort. And that doesn't mean you stop investing or suddenly play it safe, it just means you become a lot more intentional about where your money goes, and what risks are actually worth taking now. So the real question becomes, what happens if your income suddenly stops? Because if everything around you depends on it, then you're still more dependent than you probably think. And if everything around you stops the moment income stops, then you're not really stable yet. You're just actively maintaining a system that still fully depends on you. So naturally, the focus starts shifting toward things that can support you without constant effort, like income that continues, assets that grow, and systems that don't rely on you every day. And this is the part people usually ignore because one health issue now can undo more money than a bad investment ever could, which makes it less optional than most people think. So at this point, you're not really chasing wealth anymore, you're protecting what you've already built, which is a very different mindset than most people are used to having. And the biggest mistake at this stage is thinking you still have time to figure everything out later, because that later quietly becomes much sooner than most people expect. So in the end, it's not really about how much you make, it's about what actually stays when things get uncertain, and most people don't think about that until it's already uncomfortable. Which is why this isn't really about age, it's about how long you can keep ignoring these things before they quietly start affecting decisions you thought you still had control over. And the strange part is, nothing really breaks all at once, it just slowly shifts, until one day you notice you're adjusting around problems instead of actually controlling them. And you don't really notice the shift while it's happening until your options quietly start getting limited, and things that once felt flexible suddenly feel a lot more fixed. And that's the point where even small decisions start carrying more weight than they used to, because there's less room to absorb mistakes without them affecting something important. which is why clarity starts mattering a lot more than speed, because moving fast in the wrong direction now just gets you somewhere you didn't actually want to reach. And most people don't really see this shift while it's happening. They only notice it later, when fixing things feels harder than it probably should have been. Which brings it back to where we started. You're not really starting over at this stage, you're just living whatever your past decisions have quietly been building this whole time. And once you actually see that clearly, it becomes harder to ignore the small things, because they're usually the ones quietly shaping how everything turns out later. And at this stage, consistency starts mattering more than intensity, because doing something small and right repeatedly usually works better than trying to fix everything all at once. And you also start realizing that avoiding mistakes matters more than chasing big wins, because one wrong move now can quietly undo a lot more than a small win can fix. And over time, you stop looking for excitement in money decisions and start valuing stability instead, because predictable outcomes quietly become a lot more important than impressive ones. And that's usually where real financial peace actually comes from, not from having more, but from knowing that what you already have is stable, controlled, and enough. And once you reach that point, the question quietly changes from how much more you can make to how long you can keep things working without needing constant effort. Because maintaining something stable over time is actually harder than building it in the first place. It just doesn't look as impressive, so most people don't really talk about it. And in most cases, it's not one big mistake that causes problems. It's small things being ignored repeatedly until they quietly grow into something much harder to deal with. Which is why awareness becomes one of your biggest advantages at this stage, because noticing things early is usually what keeps them from turning into something much harder later. And most people don't really pay attention early. They wait until something feels uncomfortable enough to notice, which is usually when fixing it takes more effort than it should have. And that's usually where discipline starts becoming important. Not the intense kind, just the quiet habit of doing small things right even when nothing feels urgent. And that's usually why most people never really reach stability. Not because they can't, but because they don't stay consistent long enough for those small things to actually work. But the good part is, most of this is still fixable, not by doing something dramatic, just by starting to pay attention and adjusting small things before they turn bigger. The key is just starting before things feel urgent, because once it feels urgent, you're usually reacting instead of making calm, controlled decisions that actually help long term. And if you think about it, most people already know what they should fix. They just haven't really stopped long enough to look at it properly. And most of the time, it's just choosing short-term comfort over long-term stability, which feels easier in the moment but quietly makes things harder later without you noticing. And the small right decisions rarely feel exciting in the moment, but they're usually the ones quietly building something that actually holds up later when things get uncertain. And that's usually where people underestimate time, because small things don't look important early, but given enough time, they quietly turn into something much bigger than expected. And most of the time, people aren't even choosing consciously, they're just repeating what feels familiar, which is why the same patterns quietly keep showing up over and over again. And real change usually starts the moment you step out of that pattern, even slightly, because that's where you stop repeating the same results without even realizing it. And if you really look at it, most outcomes aren't sudden. They're just the result of small decisions repeating over time, which means you can still change where this goes. And the part most people miss is, this isn't really about money first, it's about behavior, because money usually just follows whatever patterns you keep repeating. And once behavior starts changing even slightly, money usually follows without needing dramatic effort, because the system adjusts itself based on what you consistently keep doing. And most people try to fix outcomes directly instead of changing the behavior causing them, which is why they keep adjusting results without actually changing what keeps creating them. And most people try to fix outcomes directly instead of changing the behavior causing them, which is why they keep adjusting results without actually changing what keeps creating them. And that's where real control actually comes from, not from reacting to outcomes, but from quietly managing the behaviors that keep creating them over time. So if anything here felt familiar, it's probably not new information, it's just something you already knew but haven't really acted on yet.
And if you actually want things to change, the next step is simpler than it sounds. It just starts with paying attention to what you're already repeating every day.
Because in the end, nothing really changes until you do. And most of what you're experiencing right now is just the result of what you kept repeating earlier.
And if this made you think a little differently, you might want to save it, because this is the kind of thing people usually come back to later. And if you know someone who probably needs to hear this, send it to them, because most people don't really think about this until it's already uncomfortable.